Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm back with another interview. I spoke with Terry Fitzpatrick of Free the Slaves. They're a group based out of DC. They have operations all around the world fighting human trafficking. And we talked about slavery and the problems that we face in the modern world. Terry is a very intelligent and great person to talk to, so I hope you enjoy this interview. So I'm here with Terry Fitzpatrick, Communications and Advocacy Director for Free the Slaves. Thanks for coming and talking to me, Terry.
Always happy to help spread the word that slavery still exists
Yeah,
and that it can be overcome.
yeah.
Even though it's been with us for 5,000 years, we're going to end it.
hmm Yeah, what's that about like the oldest profession in the world? I mean, it's
Well, the oldest, well, not profession, but certainly one of the oldest human rights abuses, because
yeah.
it goes back to the beginning of time. If people can exploit another for their profit, that's been something that unfortunately is part of human nature. But I will say this, in the 150 years ago, slavery was widespread around the world in imperial and colonial days. And back then, people thought it was morally acceptable and economically necessary. It was just baked into the world's economy. Now, the early generation of abolitionists, that seemed like an impossible challenge to try to overcome that moral and economic argument, but they did it. But what they did was outlaw slavery. They didn't actually end it. They didn't eradicate it. And slavery has taken on new forms today. And that's what our generation's task is to finish the job that was started 100, 200 years ago.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about specifically what Free the Slaves does? Because I've looked into you guys and you have stuff set up in how many countries?
Five at the moment.
Five.
There have been several. It depends on where we have grants at any
Mhm.
particular moment in time and where our certain projects are going. So we're about to hit our 20th birthday. Actually, you'll hear a lot about the number 20 if you're paying attention to the modern anti-slavery movement. In 2020, the Palermo Protocol, which is the United Nations Protocol against human trafficking, turns 20 years old. And also in 2020, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the main US law that is like the architecture of America's federal response to human trafficking, from the FBI to the State Department to the Labor Department to the Education Department. All of that's in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That turns 20 years old. And Free the Slaves turns 20 years old as well. So 2020 is a kind of a triple witching 2020 year. So I can give you a little bit of background about how we started and how we've evolved with the movement, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we started in March of 2020, and really as a kind of labor of love of four activists. One was a professor, one was a filmmaker, one was an activist, and one was an international development specialist. A book that was written called Disposable People really outlined how slavery had made a global comeback and where it was worst and why it was happening and why globalization and migration and corruption and lots of kind of global trends were giving slavery a real toehold to come back in a big way. And the number 27 million was put on the problem as the estimate around the world. Now, that's a lot. That's a big number. And the idea was that this is not just a niche, small, little problem, but that this cuts across the world. So that professor, Kevin Bales, who's now at the University of Nottingham in the UK, he has some people gather around him and say, we've got to do something about this. And so one was a filmmaker, Peggy Callahan. She was based in Los Angeles. And she said, I am going to point a camera at this, and I'm going to talk to people who are stuck in this problem. And I'm going to get every journalist who will tell this story to do so. And that was one pillar, was waking up the world to the fact that this still existed. Then Kevin Bales continued his academic quality research with peer-reviewed journal articles and scholarly level research so that there was an agreed upon high quality body of evidence, as they say in
Mhm.
universities, that we could all agree on, that this isn't just a charity trying to raise money for its programs, but that this has real academic heft to the measurement and to the understanding of why it's happening. The third activist was the third person was an activist, Jolene Smith, and her job was to get governments to do something about this. This is bigger than just what a nonprofit could do. This is not just a charity problem. This is a human rights problem and needs governmental action. Trafficking is illegal. Only governments can put traffickers in jail. So that was her goal, was to get Congress and the United Nations and other governments to start doing something. And the fourth, Jenny Bauman, was an international development specialist. And her particular insight was to not think of the individual as the victim, but to think of the community they come from as victimized. Because the kinds of things that make one person vulnerable tend to make everyone in their family vulnerable, everyone in their neighborhood vulnerable. And so she developed ideas to use the tools of international development that we adapt with clean water and building schools and building better rights for women, to use healthcare standards, how you would come in and improve the conditions for everyone in a community and apply that to this human rights challenge. And that was the four pillars that Free the Slaves was founded on 20 years ago. And we've had lots of success along those pillars. And I can talk about that in a little bit about what's been accomplished. But our mission remains central to that, which is you have to have academic quality research, you have to have public participation, and people can't participate if they're not aware. You need to have governments involved, and you need to do prevention and upliftment for both victims and the vulnerable, so that, say, if you rescue someone, they don't fall back into slavery. The conditions have changed, or someone doesn't take their place in modern slavery because you've changed the systems and the conditions that allow this to persist. So that's our general mission, and we operate different projects in different parts of the world. And right now we're in Nepal and in India and in Ghana and in Haiti and in the Dominican Republic, where we operate field programs.
Wow, that's awesome. Um, and I wanted to know, I mean, what would you say are the conditions that make a community vulnerable? Because I got involved with the Red Cord probably a couple of years ago, and I mean, I really was astonished that trafficking happens here in the United States. That was huge and eye-opening for me. I mean, so I have always seen how it can happen in a third world country, but how can it happen here? Like, what kind of conditions need to be there for trafficking to exist?
Sure. And actually, there's a connection between what happens overseas and what happens here as well. So it's different in different parts of the world. The drivers, as we would say, and the two biggest forms of modern slavery today or so we say drivers of modern slavery, are migration and debt. So let's just cover migration for a moment. There are tens of millions of people on the move inside developing countries, from rural areas to megacities, and around the world, from poorer countries to wealthier countries. They're either in search of a better life and future for themselves, or sometimes both. They're in search of a job to send money back home, remittances. And this is a largely unregulated flow of people around the world. And human migration is a fundamental human right, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the right of people to be able to move across borders with proper controls, of course, is something that we're not against. But it's a Wild West atmosphere out there right now. And what happens is that traffickers pose as legitimate labor recruiters. And once they get you away from your family, your country, your documents, your language, your legal system, then the penny drops. And now you realize, oh, this is not what I signed up for. And you're forced through fraud or sometimes coercion into labor or sex slavery. And so a lot of that comes to America's shores in that way, is people are recruited to be au pairs or possibly models, or they're come in on seasonal work, say for agricultural work, and they think they're going to get paid and they're going to be able to send money back home. And when they get here, they realize it's something different. So there's a lot of that that goes on in terms of the migrants into the US who are trafficked into the US with the intent of exploiting them, not paying them, humiliating them, beating them, and getting every last piece of work out of them. Even working as janitors or people have been trafficked into the US to work as janitors in big box stores at night, or to work on construction projects, or on gardening crews, or say housekeeping staffs at large hotels. So there's a lot of labor trafficking that goes on into the United States through migration. And the way to get at that is, of course, to help regulate the knowledge people have about what are safe pathways for migration, to regulate the labor recruiting industry, to ensure that there aren't fees that people have to pay, and so they don't end up in debt when they're here and told you have to pay off this debt, or you're indentured to us until you have paid off your airline ticket. So there's lots of ways to get at that. The other avenue globally is debt. And so, in communities where people don't have access to free healthcare or affordable healthcare, or to banks, or to, well, all sorts of services you would need in an emergency. Say a fire starts and your house is completely destroyed because there's no good fire department, or there's a drought or an earthquake or some kind of disaster that befalls your community. You have to borrow money from anyone who will lend it to you. And there are plenty of mine owners and factory owners and fishing captains and others who will say, come work for me. I will take you out of your problem. And you get to the factory or to the mine and you find out you're in conditions of slavery. You're in slavery to so-called work it off. That debt happens inside the US too, in terms of migrants who come here get told that they are responsible for their transit fees before they start earning $1. And then they're told that there's interest that it goes on top of those transit fees. And you just get deeper and deeper in debt. So that kind of debt cycle ends up trapping people inside the United States as well. But let me just then finish by saying the other driver that you see inside the United States could be inadequate foster care systems and runaway and homeless youth. People who are very, very vulnerable, and find themselves in the cash economy, will sometimes look to what is sometimes called survival sex, which is selling yourself on the street and trying to prostitute yourself out and getting trapped by traffickers and pimps who then control them for their own profit. And so you see this happen a lot. There's a very high percentage of children who find themselves, and teens who find themselves homeless over the course of a year, who end up in some kind of trafficking situation throughout the course of that year. So different drivers in different places for different industries with different individuals. So it's different everywhere. There's no one kind of universal thing, and that's why the response to it has to have so many different components.
Yeah. I mean, even here in Oklahoma, I think we have like a handful of beds for homeless children, and like and 1,000 homeless children who just have nowhere to go. And
Right,
you're right,
and
that survival sex is the pretty much the only thing they can turn to.
right, and there's no shelters, and depending on where you are, kind of couch surfing, to use the kind of hip word for it, is not a pretty thing necessarily. It's not just like you're hanging out with your friends in college. So yeah, the homelessness and also the foster care system. So what you'll find is there are traffickers who look for girls, in particular for sex trafficking, girls who are estranged from their parents or their foster parents, and maybe are hanging out at street corners or at stores or in social settings, and they befriend them and buy things for them and groom them, in a way, as called in the business. And I'm your friend. And then at some point, the individual will have a fight with either their parents or foster parents, or if they're in a group setting, and now they call for help because my friend will help me. And then you're in the back of a car, and now the hammers drop. They will take you to some city, often not your city, some other place, and now you're kept under conditions of bondage. And so there are predators amongst us who look for those vulnerabilities, just like there are overseas phony labor recruiters who also actually look for people who could be exploited and tricked into moving away from their village or their neighborhood in a city, and then they get them away from those support networks. So yeah, it's vulnerability that really helps cause this. Someone once asked me about, isn't this just a poverty problem? And if we solve poverty, we'll solve this problem. Well, the poor have always been with us, as well as slavery has, at least through recorded history. And I don't think you have to get rid of poverty to get rid of this, because while it's true that most people who fall into trafficking and slavery are poor, not all poor people are in slavery. So it's these other sets of vulnerabilities and conditions that create that kind of perfect storm that allow that person to be vulnerable when another poor person is not. So yes, poverty helps lift all boats, but you don't have to end poverty to end human trafficking and modern slavery.
Well, right. Yeah, it's not necessarily a poverty problem. Well, a lot of it goes back to just having respect for human dignity. And the problem is that the traffickers will view somebody as a commodity or something that they can purchase.
It does. And in some cases, it's by force, fraud, coercion, as they say. Fraud sometimes plays a big part of this. In some cases, parents think they're actually doing their children a favor. They think that they're being sent away to an apprenticeship program, or that they're being sent overseas for a summer of au pair work in the US or Australia or Europe or the UK. And you're tricked, and because you haven't heard about what's happening. And so it isn't always, and there are certainly bad actors who are making this happen,
Mhm.
but it isn't always, say, the fault of parents who might be sending a child into a trafficking situation that they're intending for harm to befall that child. Sometimes it's unknowingly that a child might fall into this. They think they're being sent away. We used to work on a program that just ended this year in Senegal. And in Senegal, there are Quranic boarding schools where boys go from the rural highlands to the city to memorize the Quran, part of the Islamic teaching.
Mhm.
And there aren't schools in the highlands. And so there's no structure for this religious education. And there are fake teachers who recruit children and turn them into forced begging gangs on the streets of the city
Mhm.
to just get money. And so what we've done is help educate people in the highlands what happens at some of these schools, and then to actually work with the Quranic teachers inside the city to weed out the imposters among them, to enforce the rules about what's acceptable, what are minimum standards of boarding for a boarding school for religious education. And one success we've had was the village elders in one village said, we had really no idea this was happening or that it was this bad. And they built their own school. And then they had visiting Quranic instructors come to teach the Quran to the children in the community, so that they didn't have to run any risks of the children going away from home. So sometimes it can be just as simple as building, a 20 by 20 mud hut with a tin roof, and having someone come twice a month to do religious education. And that keeps kids off the street as forced beggars in the city. So some of these interventions don't cost a lot. You just have to figure out how to break that pattern.
Yeah.
And those parents who had been sending their kids away are just saying, wow, this school is so much less than one of the other schools. I can't afford to send my child to the best school. I'll have to send them to the affordable school. And then those children end up being in forced begging. So they aren't intending to send their children into a form of forced begging slavery, but it happens. So it's a really complex set of circumstances depending on where you are.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something I've never thought about, because we have problems vetting teachers with our government here in the U.S. I mean, how many stories do you hear of abusive teachers or just nasty
Yeah,
going on here? And
I know. I have a third grader and a kindergartner, so I'm in public schools. So I'm really keen to
yeah,
understand who are the teachers and the aftercare teachers and the art teachers. It isn't just the classroom main teacher. But I'll tell you one thing that happened in the U.S. This happened maybe 10, 12 years ago. There was a choir of children from Zambia who had been brought by an evangelical minister in Texas, and they were enslaved in a choir. And they were kept in conditions of slavery, locked up. They didn't get to keep any money. They didn't get to send any money home. Their passports and documents were taken away from them. And they were brought around from church to church as a performing choir of Zambian children. So, I mean, just if there's some way to make a buck off exploiting people, somebody will try to figure out how to do that. So it happens in places you would just never think. So we have to be vigilant about that. In that case, someone in Fort Worth actually went to one of the choirs and talked to the children and just could realize something was off. The children didn't feel responsive. They were just looking down. Adults were always talking on their behalf. And these were not happy choir children like you would expect. And she did a little bit of research and blew the whistle. She actually ended up adopting one of the children. And he went and she put him all the way through dental school at Baylor University. He's now a dentist in North Texas. And so individuals spotting, see something, say something can really make a difference. There was a case at a beef packing facility in the Midwest. I forget the name of the company, where people noticed that the barbed wire on the fences was on the inside instead of the outside.
mm,
They're trying to keep people in
yeah,
on a work compound, not keep people out. What do you call that in law enforcement? A clue that something's going on there.
yeah.
And so they ended up calling the hotline, and that led to the discovery of an on site barracks where immigrant meatpacking workers were kept in conditions of slavery. And so, my advice is to remember this phone number: 888-3737-888. 888-3737-888. That's the National Human Trafficking Hotline inside the United States. It's open 24/7. They speak multiple languages, and their referral, if you're in a condition of human trafficking, they can help you. Or if you suspect something's wrong, call them. Don't intervene yourself. Call them, and they can help you figure out what to do, who to refer to, and what to do.
Awesome. Yeah. I want to get your take on this because at the Red Cord, November is No Porn November, and I wanted to get your take on what kind of links do you see between hardcore pornography and human trafficking?
Well, there's plenty of links in terms of the same web platforms, and especially dark web platforms that are used for certain pornography channels are also used to market particularly underage children, because it's quite visible and obvious that this isn't sex work because these are children. So these are not, say, adult escorts trying to be sex workers, but these are children. And so that kind of advertising vehicle happens through the dark web on sites that people do randomized VPNs and all sorts of masking of their identities to try to get. So it is, I know that some inside the US in particular, it might be easier to think that I'm not connected to this problem because I'm not a consumer of porn or I don't pay for sexual services. So I can't possibly be involved in it because that's sex slavery, right?
Mm.
Well, actually, it's mostly labor slavery, even here inside the United States. So it's in our shirts, it's in our jewelry, it's in our cell phones, and our computers. Maybe my headsets, I'm not sure. It's in our electronics, our food, our cocoa. So thinking about not wanting to be complicit on the labor slavery side of it is very important. And we like to help people recognize that the current global estimate is 40 million people right now in forms of modern slavery around the world. That's 21 million in forced labor at factories and farms and fishing camps and charcoal camps and timber production, 4 million in sex slavery, and 15 million in forced marriage slavery. So in most of the world, and even inside the US, it is predominantly a labor situation and not a sex slavery situation. Not to diminish the harm that's caused in sex slavery, but there's a connection and an enabling connection in terms of the dark web that gets used. There's an organization which maybe you'll want to talk to called Thorn.
Yes.
They're the
Yeah.
Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher Foundation. That's now called
Mhm.
Thorn, and they use digital tools to help break up these illicit internet rings that are doing particularly child exploitation, both for pornography and for human trafficking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's say for somebody listening, how do we support Free the Slaves?
Well, sure. There's three things you can do. So one is spread the word. If you go to our website, which is freetheslaves.net, you'll see under the Take Action vertical, there's all sorts of things you can do. Get one of our books for your book clubs, get some of our videos and play them for class projects or play them for a brown bag lunch. Call me. I'll be happy to speak at your workplace during a luncheon by Skype or by Zoom. Um, there are fact sheets. We have fact sheets about the extent of the problem and women and children and sex and labor and what the scope of the problem is. Print those out. They're free to print out. Hand them out. Do that in your neighborhood, at your workplace, through your church or synagogue. And so just think about spreading the word. Awareness alone won't end the problem, but we can't end the problem if people aren't aware of it. So that's one level. The second is to contribute to Free the Slaves, or if not to us, to another organization, but do something. And and adopt us as a charity. If you say have a school project or a crowdfunding project, or say your church or university club is wanting to do something and adopt us, have a birthday campaign for us on Facebook. Just facebook.com/free the slaves and donate your birthday to Free the Slaves. There's ways that you can help aggregate small contributions from your friends or your family or your coworkers or your neighbors.
Yeah.
Do
Do
what you
you guys
can
have
in a small way.
a smile.amazon?
We are on Amazon
Okay.
Smile. So if you're on Amazon Smile, just search for Free the Slaves. And so, so that we get a little click through revenue that's generated through Amazon Smile. Thanks for bringing
Yeah.
that up. And if there's other more complicated things you could do to not be complicit, which is be more aware of how you shop. Buy from farmers markets if you can. Think about buying fair trade certified products if you can. Go to a website called donegood.co. Donegood.co.
Okay.
We have a page on there, and they have other companies that vet their products for both jewelry and clothing and fashion and shoes, and vet it for environmental as well as human rights, sustainability, and accountability. If you happen to have a 401k fund where you can steer your money towards the socially responsible fund instead of just into the high growth fund. If you manage a pension fund for a school or something, or for your church, and have some investments. Think about investing with Christian Brothers or with other socially responsible funds, even in Fidelity or Working Assets or elsewhere. If you're a procurement officer and happen to be placed in some company that buys things, ask, are these products from China? If they're from China, do you ask, are they from slavery-free manufacturing? They may not be able to tell you, but the more people just start asking, the more the supply chain world starts thinking about having to clean up their product supply chains. So those are things people can do, is just help spread the word, do what charity you can for Free the Slaves or what other groups you might feel so inclined to work with. And then don't be complicit in the products you buy. Nobody wants to have slavery in our wardrobe, in our closet. And in the end, we shouldn't have to make those choices ourselves. We're working with regulators and with companies to help cleanse the American marketplace of slavery tainted goods. We can't just count on consumers to have to do that. We shouldn't have to do that. But for now, we do. So do what you can.
All right. Thank you, Terry. That's excellent information, excellent conversation. I know you got your other call, so I'm gonna let you go.
Thanks. Thanks so much. And I'm really just always happy to have an opportunities to talk to people. And if you need to reach out to us, our contact information is on the website, and we're happy to help support schools and class projects and groups that are working on this to help spread the word and get something started. So it's freetheslaves.net. Thanks.
All right. Awesome, Terry. Thank you. All right, that does it for another episode of Action is the Antidote. If you want to get involved, please get your tickets for our annual Freedom Gala, January 25th at the Hilton Garden Inn. We're having keynote speaker Tim Ballard come and talk with us about what he does. All around badass, sets up sting operations to go in and break up human trafficking rings. We're also going to be auctioning off some great packages and great items. Again, at the Hilton on January 25th, the Red Cord's annual Freedom Gala.
We fight for freedom!